Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started with our evening panel, social media and freedom of speech. Um, I'm Gus Hurwitz, University of Nebraska College of Law. I am going to be pulling double duty, both moderating this panel and offering some substantive comments of my own to get things going. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to frame up our discussion today. So regulation of speech online, social media, freedom of speech. You might have noticed over the last couple of years, there have been some speech-related issues arising with social media and the internet. I probably don't need to really offer much framing discussion for what these concerns are. Beyond saying that they are widespread, they are raising hard questions about our basic commitments to the First Amendment, our understanding of the First Amendment, relatively famously for a less than year-old Supreme Court opinion. One of his last opinions, Justice Kennedy referred to social media as the modern public square, raising a lot of questions about what the First Amendment means when it comes to online speech. Is speech on Facebook protected by the First Amendment? Is Facebook itself as a platform on which that speech is occurring protected by the First Amendment? We have concerns about the role of the news media online, the fake news media, online. We've got questions about election interference and regulation of political speech online. So lots of questions here. We also have a lot of activity from legislatures and governments around the world relating to adjacent issues. So one thing I'm going to mention, I'll talk about this a little bit more, and some others I'm sure we'll talk about this as well. In the United States, we have Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is sometimes referred to as the First Amendment for the Internet, which has created a very strong presumption of immunity or presumption against liability for online information hosts, content providers, both for hosting problematic speech that has been uploaded by users and also for moderating however they see fit that speech. There's a lot of active discussion in the United States today about whether we need to rethink the parameters of Section 230 to impose more obligations on these providers, or whether or not that would be exceptionally problematic, harmful, both to speech values and to the technological architecture of the internet. In the European Union, in the last year, the GDPR has gone into effect. This is a massive regulation that affects what platforms can do with information that they collect about European citizens, how they can use it, how they can collect it, what control European citizens have over that information. And due to the way that the regulation is written, these controls and these obligations expand to many non-European platforms. We have in California the recently enacted California Consumer Privacy Act, which is a hot mess. I believe that is the official term, or dumpster fire might be the official term. I understand that yesterday the California Attorney General announced that 5 days from now they're going to have the first of 6 hearings on how the CCPA is supposed to be implemented. There are tons of questions about it. We have a recently enacted piece of legislation, the California Bots Act, which requires bots, that is automated text-based things that you can interact with online, bots, to identify themselves as bots when, under some circumstances, when they're being used online. We have discussion about when I say we in discussion, I mean I just had the final article sent to the publisher for a new article I have on the First Amendment and robocalls. The FCC has new regulations that they've actually not put in place, how they classify text messages for the purposes of robocall regulation. So we have a lot of regulation about robocalls, automated messaging online. We have the Can Spam Act. So we have regulations of different types of speech. So we have lots of stuff going on in the background here. We've got statutory concerns both in the United States and the European Union. We have old statutes, new statutes, and we have the complete common law framework in the background here to address some of these concerns. So we have 5 panelists for our discussion today, and we're going to hear a lot of diverse topics. I think the nature of this issue is there are a lot of moving parts, and we're going to throw a lot of stuff onto the table and then come back together for some questions and discussion after that. So by way of very, very brief introduction, just names and affiliations, I'll ask speakers to, if they think it's relevant, to say anything more about their background for their comments. Our first speaker is going to be Hannibal Travis at Florida International University, followed by me, Gus Hurwitz. I won't say any more. Followed by Josephine Nelson at Villanova. Followed by Aaron Wright at Cardozo, followed by Ricardo Epstein, I believe. Is that correct?
Oui, sir.
Okay, yes. Someone who needs no introduction in this room. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Hannibal. We'll each take about 10 minutes or so for some introductory comments and then get into some back and forth and questions.
Thank you all for having me today. Thought I would come in a little bit under time with my comments. So I'll say a few words about the interaction between the First Amendment and public regulation of speech, what the state actors can do, and then a little bit about what the private actors can do, and whether there's any right of speakers to access privately owned platforms that have content moderation strategies or policies that tend to exclude certain categories of speakers. So a place that we often start in the First Amendment when we're talking about violence or threats is the clear and present danger test, or the threat of imminent lawless action. The speech is likely to produce imminent lawless action. In other words, not that some years down the road there will be a revolution or that somebody might be inspired on the fringes to do something, but not necessarily the reasonable person, but that some composite of people are likely to act lawlessly in hearing the speech. The Watts and the Hess cases are sort of famous for articulating this. And they've been applied in a number of cases where people sue because, for example, there's been a cop killing and the perpetrator's listening to rap music like Tupac or Ice-T, or somebody committed suicide and they were playing Dungeons and Dragons or listening to Ozzy Osbourne. Or
Who are these people?
There's a bunch of these cases from the 80s. School shooters played Doom or watched The Basketball Diaries or watched Natural Born Killers or other violent pictures. And of course, the question is, the speech in all of those cases did not ask the actor to perpetrate the violent act, nor was it particularly likely to do so. There was an intervening cause, a superseding cause of the actor's own makeup or decision, that you could not fairly attribute the action to the speaker or say that it was foreseeable by releasing that movie or CD that the actor would act in that way. So that raises a lot of questions about what can be regulated online if you cannot even impose civil liability in such a circumstance, because many times what public officials are trying to regulate, particularly in other countries, but increasingly in congressional hearings, are not speeches that asks the listener or the reader to engage in imminent lawless conduct, but that say something more generally offensive or revolutionary or unpopular. And the First Amendment would tend to protect that material under that sort of line of clear and present danger cases. Now, under international human rights law, there's a couple of other categories that are treated differently than violence, or they are sort of subcategories of violence, one of which is propaganda for war, and the other one of which is incitement to racial hatred. And in the European courts and in the UN, sometimes they're called upon to answer the question, well, what are those categories and what does that mean? Of course, there's a lot of speech that goes on on television and the newspaper that relates to possible wars, existing wars, conflicts between groups, and the decisions that reflect these two prongs sometimes say, or these two definitions sometimes focus on the context of the speech and the extent to which it's an incitement versus a general commentary or expression of a political opinion. So The expression of a nonviolent political opinion or attempts by a government to block or remove nonviolent expression is sort of at the core of freedom of expression, both in terms of the First Amendment and in terms of international human rights. When we get to fake news and libel and other forms of harassment, fake news in the United States is not actionable even if it's a gross departure from journalistic standards unless the speaker subjectively entertains serious doubts as to the falsity of the information. So you can't tell necessarily reading a comment or watching a video whether the speaker subjectively did not believe it or entertained serious doubts. Oftentimes this kind of thing has to go to trial. There was a trial of Courtney Love for libeling on somebody on Twitter. Sometimes these cases are dismissed before trial because the expression was not meant to be taken literally or was rhetorical hyperbole. So it's unclear how Congress or the states could pass a law constitutionally regulating fake news sort of on its face and without regard to the New York Times versus Sullivan standard and other standards. Domestic law defines propaganda as the self-aggrandizement of a government entity or purely partisan political activity or covert government expressions of opinion that are not disclosed as having a governmental source. Now, a lot of the focus has been foreign governments covertly making political expressions without disclosing the source. And opinion is kind of divided about whether that can constitutionally be prohibited. On the one hand, foreign speakers have no constitutional right unless they are resident here. On the other hand, the listener might have a freedom of speech interest in reading or hearing the foreign government's point of view, maybe not necessarily unlabeled, but in general, reading what foreign governments think. I mean, our government believes that foreign audiences have an interest in hearing what our government thinks, so why wouldn't our residents have an interest in hearing what foreign governments think? There's a line of Supreme Court cases that say that even if the speaker does not have the right to make the particular statement that is being made, like a prisoner, for example, or to read the particular publication, the sender of the publication or the recipient of the prisoner's communication could have a right to receive the prisoner's communication or to send something to the prisoner. So you have to consider both sides of the equation, the speaker and the listener, the writer and the recipient or the reader. One area that, the last thing I'd like to speak of is the right of public access to private platforms. Of course, all this doesn't apply to the private platforms. They can adopt content moderation policies of their choice and be associated with whatever, in terms of advertising, political expression, and so forth that they would like to be. There is a limit to that they may run up against. It's being articulated in the Prager University case, which you might have heard of, which is California's civil rights law, the Unruh Act, which protects not only racial and religious minorities from discrimination in places of public accommodation, but also possibly people holding unusual political views or who are victims of arbitrary discrimination on other grounds. And it remains to be seen how sort of political minorities or people voicing unpopular views could avail themselves of that law. Those claims were severed and thrown back to the state courts once the federal court decided that YouTube was not acting as a state actor in the Prager University case. The court decided not to exercise supplemental jurisdiction. So we may get a decision from the California state courts saying, on the one hand, is there a right of access by those harboring unpopular political views to a private platform under California civil rights law or the California Constitution? Or on the other hand, is the right of the platform not to be associated with that which it disagrees with prevail under the First Amendment, under the Hurley parade case and its sort of progeny about compelled speech. In the net neutrality debate, sometimes we've made a distinction between the road and the cars on the road. The road should be neutral. Everyone should be able to drive on the road. The people who provide electricity should not be able to discriminate in terms of political views or other criteria in terms of who receives electricity. But people can put a license plate of their choice on their car or paint their car how they would like. People who organize a parade don't have to include any and all comers in the parade. Are private online platforms like Google or Facebook that become so large they become almost an essential facility or public utility, are they more like the road, or are they more like cars on the road or parades on the road that have this kind of subjective opinion in terms of how they rank things, what they include, what they exclude, and so forth? It's not exactly clear how that will be resolved. There was recently a case forcing LinkedIn to continue to provide certain data to one of its users, and the court sort of rejected LinkedIn's point of view that it could decide in its sole discretion with whom to deal as a social media network. That could possibly have some impact, although that was an antitrust case and not necessarily applicable to the civil rights context. But I think that's an area that could be ripe for application to social media. And finally, one sub point to that is that there could be a situation of a privatized public forum. The court hearing the Trump tweet feed case, where Trump was blocking people from commenting on his feed, said that was a public forum because the White House controlled it. Well, what if social media platforms host presidential debates, weekly addresses by the White House and Pentagon social media accounts, and people become accustomed to using the comment pages of that as an interactive public forum to express their views. If somebody gets blocked from the platform, they're blocked from part of the government's activity, the government's speech. Maybe that Trump blocking case could apply to that kind of a situation. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hannibal. A lot of interesting stuff there that I'm not going to let myself comment on until we get to questions. I'm not going to talk about Elon Musk, even though I really want to. So for my own thoughts, we are in a fascinating era to be thinking about First Amendment issues and what the nature of speech is generally, not just online. There are, when I think about how speech happens online, really two central challenges to traditional First Amendment doctrine. The first is what we can call the velocity of speech, and the second is the loss of intermediaries. Velocity of speech means the speed at which information enters into the discourse and needs to be processed before it can be meaningfully used. And the loss of intermediaries refers to the idea that we now talk to each other directly instead of relying on third parties to filter the news and information that gets to us. You log on to Twitter and you're hearing directly from the president or Elon Musk. You're not hearing from news agencies or PR shops what they want to say. To state both of these ideas in a slightly different way, the differences that we're seeing are a really low cost of producing information and of distributing that information. This means that the amount of information that individuals, that every person that has access to the internet has access to, has been growing exponentially over the last several years. How has our ability to process that information been growing? Well, if it's been growing at all, it's probably growing at best linearly. That is, we have an exponential increase in the amount of information that we're expected to process and understand and use, but we have a constant, a flat, or a linear growth in our ability to actually use the information. That's a pretty problematic, pretty classic sort of complexity problem that we face here. So I think about this in three different ways I want to put on the table, and I would say that none of these give us satisfactory answers for how to understand what we should do about the challenges raised by speech online, but hopefully they give us interesting and useful lenses to think about what these problems are. So the first is our traditional marketplace of ideas sort of framework. This is where we would rely on traditional forms of competition in order to address concerns about the quality of information. Bad ideas enter the stream of discourse. Well, over time, they're going to lose out to better ideas. If you have a source of information that is relatively low quality, over time, it's going to be pushed out of the market as its low quality information is called out and better sources of information enter the stream of information. And in fact, the fact that a information source is putting out low quality information creates a competitive opportunity for entry by those who would offer better information. I'm saying low quality stuff Hannibal can step in and say, Professor Hurwitz is wrong, here, here, here. Well, my reputation just went to garbage. His reputation goes up. I'm out, he's in. It's good for the marketplace of ideas. When we have a situation where the amount of information is growing exponentially and our ability to process it isn't growing at a commensurate rate, and especially where we're seeing direct person-to-person information without some sort of filter or intermediary, what we see happening is the burden of processing and verifying and making sure of the quality of information is being shifted to the recipient of the information. Traditionally, we would rely on intermediaries. We would rely on the New York Times or the Washington Post to filter the information and say, this is the high quality information, this is the low quality information. Today, we're asking every user of Twitter to do that job, to figure out, is this high quality information, is it low quality information? And there are important and challenging externality and free riding concerns here. If I want to put bad ideas out into the market, what does that do to everyone who is listening to me? Well, everyone who is listening to me now bears the burden of evaluating the veracity of my ideas. What if Hannibal wants to say, well, what Professor Hurwitz just said is wrong? Well, instead of it now being a half dozen or a dozen reporters who need to incur the costs of evaluating that information, it's 300 million people on Twitter who each individually need to evaluate that information. And in fact, if Hannibal wants to, sorry, Hannibal, you're the name I picked out of the hat. If Hannibal wants to send out good information, he now has a higher entry cost. Before he can start putting out his good information, he needs to overcome the noise that I've put into the ecosystem. So he needs to remedy the externality that I've created before he can start competing on the merits. So what we see is a race to the bottom here. This is the clickbait ecosystem where you can't be a successful, high-quality news source because the ordinary consumer of news doesn't have the resources to evaluate whether or not The Onion or the New York Times has more accurate information. I'm not going to comment on which is better or worse. The average reader needs to evaluate this on their own. If the New York Times has really complicated, sophisticated headlines with subheadlines and diaeresis marks over their umlauts over their doubled up vowels that many readers don't understand, well, you're increasing the cost that your readers bear before they even get to accessing the information. So we have a race to the bottom in the marketplace of ideas. Not a great place to be starting. So what's our alternative to the marketplace of ideas? Well, one of the traditional alternatives is Madison's perspective on democratic institutions. In Madison's mind, one of the great virtues of our federal representative system is that it slowed down the deliberative process. He wanted our country to be deliberatively slow. He wanted when factions were forming, when popular opinions were starting to infect the minds of the many, he wanted to have politicians there as circuit breakers to say, okay, we hear you, let's slow down and think about this before we turn this idea into policy. He viewed the largeness and both geographic largeness and population largeness of the country as virtues, because it meant it would take a long time for ideas to spread, giving us time to be deliberative about them and have a reasonable process in how we turn those ideas into action. There's a subtle irony, perhaps, in this, which is that the Federalist Papers were really written and pushed out in a very quick way, given the technology of the time. But we have different speeds with the fastest technologies of the 18th century and the 21st century. So my takeaway, my distillation of this Madisonian perspective is to respond to our common a trope that the response to bad speech is more speech. Perhaps that's exactly wrong. I'll turn technically to why that might be exactly wrong in a moment, but perhaps what we need isn't more speech, but slower speech. Perhaps the response to the exponential growth in the velocity of information is some way to slow that information down. What that means, I've got no idea, but I'll put the idea on the table. I'm just going to throw out a lot of high velocity ideas at you and put the burden on you, externalize the burden on you to figure out what to do with them. So a third thing they want to put on the table is the information theory perspective. Information theory, this is a formal field of mathematics. It is frankly the theory that gave us the internet in many ways. The core insights of information theory can be explained fairly straightforwardly, which is that the capacity of any channel of information, the amount of information that any channel can carry, is proportional to the ratio of the signal to noise in that channel. So signal is the good, useful, meaningful information. Noise is stuff that interferes with that. So if my voice is the signal, I'm speaking to you right now, and there's a lot of background, there's construction going on outside, or other panelists are having a side conversation, that would be noise. And in order for me to overcome that noise, I would either need to increase my signal, speak more quickly, or I would need to slow down and speak more clearly. Now, if I'm slowing down, the speed at which I'm able to communicate is going to be decreased. Obviously, I'm speaking more slowly. Oddly, if I start screaming, if I speak more loudly, that's also going to slow down the amount of information that I can get to you over a channel in a given period of time. For various reasons I'm not going to talk about right now, but the more noise in the channel, the less signal can get through. And historically, when we're not talking technically, that might not be a huge challenge because we don't process information at our maximum capacity in our day-to-day lives. But when we're transitioning to the online ecosystem, our new information economy, where we're constantly seeing our Twitter feeds getting updated, perhaps that's changing, and we're approaching the capacity of our information channels. One of I can't help myself, one of my favorite papers that I've ever seen has nothing to do with the law. It's a study of various languages spoken around the world. And there are lots of languages. There are languages with a relatively small vocabulary of words that are used frequently. There are languages with very massive vocabulary where in order to be a fluent speaker, you need to know hundreds of thousands of words. There are languages where people tend to speak slowly. There are languages where people talk very, very quickly and it's hard to understand them because you really can't keep up with what they're saying. Well, this paper studied all these languages and it found that the information capacity of all of the languages studied was actually about constant. That it didn't matter if you speak quickly or slowly, you've got big words, you've got lots of words. Generally, languages where people speak more slowly, you have a wider range of words. So each word can convey more information, but might take longer to say it. So a fascinating study that I think really validates this information theory idea as applying to humans. So there are two real key takeaways I want to give you from the information theory perspective. The first is that when you try to send more information in a channel than that channel can carry, that information becomes noise. So if I'm talking too quickly for you to understand what I'm saying, you're hearing noise, not signal. When you have that exponential growth at the rate in which information is coming in, perhaps we're just giving you noise, not signal, which decreases the overall capacity of us to exchange meaningful information. There's an important challenge, a fundamental problem in information theory, which is how do you know what is signal versus noise? I say a word, I say computer. If you don't know what that word means, it's noise. If you know what the word computer means, it's information. Well, this brings us back to the idea that we're pushing the burden of processing the information to the consumer. If we're giving the consumer of information so much information that they can't process it, Well, they can't differentiate the substantive information from the signal, that is, from the background junk information, the noise, so it all becomes noise. So suddenly speech is valueless, and not just valueless, but it's harming. There's again the externality problem. It's harming everyone else's ability to interpret that speech. So 3 ideas there. The marketplace of ideas yields a race to the bottom competitively, the Madisonian perspective. Perhaps we don't need more speech, we need slower speech. And the information theory perspective, that when you have all of this signal coming in, it becomes noise, not signal, and our ability to communicate is diminished. Thank you. Now, as moderator, I'm going to hand things over to Josephine.
All right.
We actually re-reversed.
Re-reverse.
So I'll get up here so I can show you something. All right, I'll start talking when she works. So I am not a constitutional law scholar. I'm interested in business ethics, and I like to talk to you a little bit about how the integration of social media and technology can stifle free speech. And the examples of what I want to show you are mostly coming from China, because that is where a lot of this is being used in its utmost form. Although I want to caution and say, although most of these examples come from China, we are seeing more and more of these techniques being used in other countries, certainly in Turkey, Russia, Brazil, elsewhere. So I pulled some GIFs for you. I'll show them to you at the end. But I'll talk to you a little bit about what's happening in China, how technology is being used to control behavior in China. And I also, if we have time, talk to you a little bit about the role of US tech companies in contributing to these forms of control of speech, and frankly, how uncomfortable a lot of their employees are in contributing to this work, and some of the protests that have been happening inside these companies, and then some of the ethical issues that involves. So quickly, a first overview of what's happening with technology in China. A lot of the technology used in China—
Could somebody turn the lights down a bit?
I'll get to that. A lot of the technology used in China is very overtly being used for social control of the 1.4 billion people in their population. The stated goal is eventually to create a social credit system where there are real-time adjustments to your social credit score, and that social credit score would affect your ability to do all kinds of things. It would affect your ability to travel. It affects your ability to buy plane tickets, train tickets, rent cars, your ability to get credit, your ability to rent an apartment, your ability to buy real estate, your ability to get jobs. It in every way controls your social opportunities within the country. And this program of social credit is growing, and the government is using technology as a basis for creating these real-time credit scores. So what kinds of things go into your credit score? Your medical information, your educational information, your criminal background, financial transactions, but also everything that you say and do. So if the government finds something that you say or do on the internet to be objectionable, that goes into your social credit score. Also, it monitors your interactions at all times and your movements through cities. So for example, it feeds into your social credit score if you go through the grocery store and you're in the grocery store aisle and you grab a bottle of alcohol, that diminishes your social credit score because there's an assumption that you're going to drink it and be rowdy or do something else. If you put the alcohol back and you go down to the next aisle and you buy diapers, that increases your social credit score. And that is happening in real time. Also, all of your social media presence, everything that you do on the internet, everything you do on your phones, taps into your social credit score. So there's also, I'd let you know, there's no way to appeal your social credit score. So if you are blacklisted from traveling, if you are blacklisted from getting an apartment, if you're blacklisted from doing anything, there's no appeal process. and you don't necessarily know how your social credit score is being calculated. The stated desire of the Communist Party is to open the world to people that they find desirable, and to literally shut down the movement and the speech of anyone that they find undesirable. And so they control what goes into that credit score, and by your credit score, literally try to shut down your movements, shut down your speech. Will cut you off from the internet, will cut you off from having followers for your social media platforms and being able to perform your profession. Certainly we've seen this happen with journalists who are trying to report on corruption within the Communist Party. There are three main ways that people in China see the social credit score system every single day. And I'll spend the most time with the Sharp Eyes project, because I think that that's really interesting. And we're seeing more and more use of this technology in the US by the US government and by other governments that we wouldn't expect to have the same agenda, but is really interesting. The term sharp eyes comes literally from Chairman Mao's saying, the masses have sharp eyes. The idea is that you are being watched at all times in all places. And the government is recording this and processing this information. So they're using a combination of deep machine learning and artificial intelligence, AI integration, applications to create to go through a massive database. And it's based on facial recognition software. The really amazing thing about this software, so everyone in China has their face scanned. And if you go through any kind of contacts with the Chinese governments, any international airports, anything else, they'll have a record of your face and be watching for you. With the deep machine learning applications, they can adjust for light, for angle, for facial hair. They can age you up, they can age you down. It's very hard to actually get around the facial recognition software. And there are 170 million cameras posted all around the 50 largest cities in China where the Sharp Eyes project is operational now. The Sharp Eyes project is being expanded dramatically. There are going to be another 570 million cameras to come within the next 3 years. And everything and everyone, everywhere is being monitored for everything that they do. So the gifts that I pulled are from the Sharp Eyes project, but let me just talk to you a little about the other two pieces of the social credit system and what you see in terms of technological control. Aaron will talk more about the Great Firewall of China. This is the crackdown and control of the internet. It uses individual searches and browsing history and anything that they say as a record to track their behavior and to let the government know what's happening. And it literally censors certain searches. So China is, by the way, the most digitally connected country in the world. More than half of its population, so around 780 million people are online, and the Chinese use cell phones constantly. They are constantly on their cell phones using digital media. It's the largest e-commerce market in the world. There is no online anonymity of any type, so they've cracked down on virtual private networks, which was a way of getting around having everything that you search and do online assigned to you. In August of 2017, Apple, by July 2017, Apple had been forced to remove virtual private networks, VPNs, from all of its stores and phones in China. August 2017, the Chinese detained and jailed local software developers who tried to do workarounds. September 2017, there was a law that anyone who sets up a chat group is legally responsible for all content on it, and had to be traceable. Internet providers in China after this must track and score users to ensure that they follow socialist core values, which are dictated by the Communist Party.
Jesus Christ.
As of June 2016, China had blocked 165 of the world's top 1,000 most popular websites. It had shut off about 26,000 Google search terms and 880 Wikipedia pages. That there's no way to get to most foreign media content. and the censorship conditions are constantly evolving. So with any new meme, the censors adjust.
It's time
By
for-
the way, I do want to let you know that similar things are happening in China and Russia and Brazil and elsewhere.
Brazil?
Yes, very much so. And they've also shut down WhatsApp in Brazil repeatedly, which is a Facebook product. We talked about that, but it has end-to-end encryption. So the third part. Sorry, I'll just go really quickly. Third part, cyber hacking.
Into the
What's
mic,
that?
talk to the mic.
Okay, sure. The third part, I'll just do really quickly, and then I'll show you the GIFs. Cyber hacking, spying, and commercial espionage are part of this program. So everybody's been talking about how the Made in China program wants to push the Chinese economy to be a hub of technological innovation. And as part of that, yes, there's industrial espionage, commercial espionage. Boeing has been a big victim of this. Many other companies have. And it's not just China, it's North Korea, Russia, Eastern European gangs. Lots of people are involved. But the way that China is using their hacking is very interesting, and it feeds into what we're talking about, the social control and the social credit system. So the large-scale hacks that you've seen of the Office of Personnel Management in the US, the US Navy, and the Marriott hotel chains, what they're looking for is trying to track people's movements. They're interested in who's staying where and where people of interest are moving. That's why they're looking at those particular sites. They're trying to, and so the Chinese government is readily selling and making available this information on people on the internet. So for about $100, you can get on anyone a full list of hotels that they check into and who they stayed with in the hotels, airline flights taken, internet cafes visited, border entries and exits, apartment rentals and real estate holdings, and you're able to pay to pinpoint with real-time information their exact location via their cell phone and detailed information about their banking transactions, as well as driving infractions and any train journeys. So you can get that right now for nothing on almost anyone. And all of that is part of what's going into this. Okay, I'm not gonna have time to do some of these other things, but let me show you the gifts. That would be the moment.
What's going on now? Are you hacking this?
Yes.
The computer keeps shutting down to prevent the hacking.
All right,
Yeah.
so I want to show you, this is the Sharp Eyes project. And I just took a tiny snippet of something that was, this is from The Economist's. Yeah, I know. Oops, I want to go back. Sorry, here we go. So I just looped about 3 seconds. So this is tracking, these are street cameras. They're showing you all the traffic, they're mounted everywhere, and you can find on anyone, who they are, what their entire social history, their credit, where they're going, where the patterns are, patterns of movement, patterns of transactions. I'll show you some others. Okay, here's crowd software, which is active in China. And you can see masses of, this is loading. Here you go. So you can see that they're using heat sensors for the crowd, which makes sense, because if you want to control, there you go. If you want to control the crowd, you can see, but I also want to show you they can track, so here's a heat sensor, but they can track people's movements through a crowd, and they can also track anyone they talk to, any handoffs, any transactions, any odd behavior. And this is happening everywhere. Here, I'll show you some of the, there's a system going straight through everyone who walks through the streets in China. Their facial recognition software is constantly monitoring them and putting them against lists of people who are of interest to to the government. This is in on the sunglasses, on the glasses of all the police in China, as well as hooked to the body cameras on all and most police officers. And they arrest and apprehend people in real time.
Great. Makes me feel better.
So I also want to show you the link to social
You
media.
got time.
Sorry, way over. Okay, wrap it up. This is the link to social media. Jaywalking. If you jaywalk anywhere in China, your face is projected on billboards around the city, and this goes to social media accounts listing you, what you've done, and you. It also links to social media platforms, and you get your fine by the instant message text. Okay. I wanted to
really go in New York.
And this is one I wanted to show you. The applications of this are also to read emotions and sexuality. So the idea is that you could find out what somebody is thinking before they act. This is an application tracking a bus driver for how tired he is and his emotional state, so that he gets pulled off the job if at any point his emotions register anger, fear, or overly tired. And this is being used in crowd scanning technology, so they can find you. And this is actually being used by the U.S. government in airports as well, in big international airports. If you have an emotion that registers across your face, the facial recognition technology will flash it up, and they'll start watching you. All right. The last one I'm not going to show you, but it's about the police state. The largest open air prison in the world is Zhejiang province in the westernmost corner in China, where the Uyghur population lives. About 92% of Chinese are Han Chinese, and it's a very small ethnic minority population in China, but they're concentrated in certain areas, including in the Zhejiang province. And in Zhejiang province, everything you do is monitored. The Uyghur population, there are 100 million of them that have disappeared into re-education camps, and you cannot move more than 300 feet from your door. Everything, you're searched at least 12 times a day by the police, and everything you do is monitored, and all your interactions, everyone you socialize with will disappear at the same time if you in any way do several things that the government finds objectionable, and most of those have to do with speaking out against government repression.
So on that cheery note, possibly I think we can frame this as we live right now in the United States, and many of our concerns about social media and its effects on speech come from the lack of regulation of these platforms. Well, do we want to regulate these platforms? Do we want to give the state control over these platforms? Perhaps this dystopian picture that has been painted, which we are starting to see in many ways in the United States, is the alternative if we decide we want to try and deal with the social media problem? Question mark, queuing things up for questions. But before we get there, Aaron.
Thanks. And after hearing these types of developments in China and other parts of the globe, I think many people are left with the taste that technology is not great. It's bad. We should run for the hills. We should kind of reverse course. I think what I'm going to really focus in on today is to talk about a more positive picture of technology, particularly blockchain technology, and unpack how this technology actually provides a solution to many of these problems and has profound implications when it comes to guarding and protecting First Amendment rights. So I think, Gus, I thought that was a really great way to frame up some of these speech issues that, there's issues related to speed and disintermediation. I'm going to throw a third one there, which is authentication. And authentication is one of the issues that I think blockchains can help, because they can help actually reverse these signal-to-noise issues. Blockchains may, over the long run, really help these issues because we have, for the first time in really history, the ability to start embedding large and widespread code-based rules that are hard to change and modify. So people can choose to encode rules, not through a centralized platform like a Facebook and a Twitter or something administered by the state, but something that they can collectively agree upon and have administered. So I've referred to these as Lex Cryptographica rules, and recent work that I've done with Primavera di Filippi. So blockchains have a lot of hype, and it's still in its infancy, but it has a potential to really impact content and media and may provide technological solutions to these legal issues, in part because it boils down to who should really control this algorithm, who should control the algorithms for disseminating and servicing news and other information. And blockchains really offer the hope of having the control over these algorithms not be in the hands of the government, a large organization or corporation, but in new forms that are more participatory and less hierarchically controlled. So for those that don't know much about blockchains, they really combine a host of legacy technology that was developed largely in the 1970s and 1990s, peer-to-peer networks, public-private key cryptography, and something known as a consensus mechanism on popular blockchains like Bitcoin. It's a Nakamoto consensus, also referred to as proof of work. And it's through this combination, it's created a novel data structure. And this data structure has unique characteristics we haven't seen in data and information before. So unlike information today, which can move really fast, it's very flimsy, you can lose it, it's not particularly resilient. Blockchains are almost the opposite. It actually makes information slow, and it actually uses complex computational algorithms to slow down information. And by slowing down the information, the way information is stored in these data structures, we have, for the first time in history, data that's tamper-resistant, resilient, non-reputable, so you can prove what the source is of that information. And also, what's interesting in these networks, they're very, very market-driven. They market-based incentives kind of at their core. So market-based incentives are baked into the way these data structures operate and really provide a platform for anchoring things that are akin to property rights online. And it's all really able to achieve this because of this ability to slow down information. So because blockchains are a fairly incorruptible data storage system, that they inherently, and they rely on public-private key cryptography, you can digitally sign any information that is being generated or transacted on the network. So each transaction to the network is signed by a private key. You can think of it as like a password, and it's associated with a public address. You can think of it like an email address. So that means that publishers can actually prove that they're the source of information. They can have a public address, something that we know is associated with a particular publisher. They can create a unique fingerprint for any content that they produce, and they can sign it. They can attest that they are the source of that information. What that means is that we can create authenticated whitelists of news sources from vetted sources. So if the concern is that there's too much noise because we do not know who the publishers are, here's a way that we're able to actually prove who the publishers are, authenticate that. So you may say, well, then this raises the question of who should control this registry or some sort of whitelist. Blockchains also, because of these market-based incentive systems, are able to begin to curate lists in a much more decentralized way using something that folks are referring to as crypto-economic systems. So one real notable crypto-economic system that's emerging is called the token curated registry. It enables disparate groups to basically attest to a fact, post a bond, and other members of the network can basically uncover if that information is false and collect that bond that's been posted. So it creates a way to self-police and to create a vetted whitelist that isn't centrally controlled. That means that we can start having organizations, media outlets, basically plug into these registries without having to do the content moderation themselves. The public or the large network of people can be the ones that authenticate and attest those news sources. So obviously this has limitations and it requires buy-in, but there's hope that you can actually have some sort of authentication that is provided by these blockchains along with in systems that can be broad and participatory in order to understand what information is being provided. So that gives me some hope. This isn't all a pipe dream. These are projects that already exist. This is all technology that's rolled out. There was a notable project called Civil, which is trying to implement this in mass. It's being run by the former president of NPR, so it has pretty widespread support. At the same time, to kind of combat this dystopian future that we just
it has to be like this. I'm just reporting what's going on.
Oh,
in one place.
Doesn't have to be.
Yeah, but I think there's a real risk that we are going in that way. Well, blockchains, because their unique characteristics, are also great to guard against this. So blockchains can store information in a tamper-resistant way. That means once you store information in a blockchain, it's effectively and nearly impossible to delete it. Just to give you some context, if you engage in a transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain in order to change one record, it costs about $3 to $4 billion to do so. So you have to basically buy $3 to $4 billion worth of computers and pay that amount in electricity in order to change one transactional record. So you can think of it as creating a way to move beyond paper-based records and also store information that you want people to see. So we're seeing folks use this technology to combat issues related to censorship, particularly in places like China. They're storing records of certain information that's being taken down by various different censors in China. There's also new techniques that are being used to stop and prevent domain name blocking, which is what happens both in the United States and also in other countries in order to take down information that may be deemed too sensitive for the particular local jurisdiction. So these are technological solutions that may and eventually could, if deployed and broadly used, start to chip away at the Great Firewall in China. If there is a website, you can create means that preclude the government from shutting it down or preventing access to it, because you store various different DNS records underneath on the chain, and you can route it all the way through. At the same time, if you have information that you need to disseminate, you need to take advantage of this disintermediation and the speed and the velocity of what the internet can provide. You now have a backstop for that. Now that raises some tricky questions. It's great if it's being used in China, but it can also be used to disseminate things like state secrets or potentially obscene or inflammatory material as well. So it doesn't solve those issues, but at least provides a backstop to do that. And I think the really interesting thing here is these are not legal solutions, right? These are solutions that are being implemented almost technologically. So it's not being implemented in a top-down bureaucratic way. It's being implemented in a participatory bottom-up way and relying on rules that are not hierarchically and bureaucratically provided, but really administered by groups online. So it really becomes in the marketplace of ideas, the idea of which of these systems are best to kind of govern the internet going forward. And I think we've seen, particularly as networks become quite large, that as network effects take hold, that they tend to have a persistent staying power. So I think there's a real opportunity for us, particularly in the US, to begin to shape what these networks should provide, what tools should be built on top of them, and then disseminate them broadly. If we do so, then we can imagine that those will become the rule set for the future. And I think that that's an incredibly important and necessary thing for us to do going forward. So that's about it.
My God, I am so thoroughly depressed by what's going on in China that I don't know whether I should have spoken first, last, or not at all. That's the way I would put it. But my stated position is, as ever, somebody who knows a little bit about technology, very little, a little bit about the First Amendment, and to try to take those two bits of knowledge and put them together to give some kind of a framework from the outside that could be used to examine particular documents that start to take place, whether you're talking about the social media in the United States, a comprehensive government overview, or whatever. And as a normative matter, I've come to the sort of following general conclusion that applies not only to cyberspace, to virtually every human endeavor that you care to mention. I think as a general matter, if you live in a strong tradition in which you have limited government, strong property contracts, and autonomy rights, the definition of what these rights ought to be and what they ought to entail is something which you can describe with a great deal of precision. And one of the things that you have to do, of course, is to say that you're not allowed to harm other individuals. And then you must immediately go back and to say, well, what do you mean by harm? And you better come up with a conclusion that relates to the use of force and fraud, but one which excludes competitive harms from the particular situation. Because in the one case, the private application of force against one person results in a diminution of the social pie. In the other case, the ostensible loss to a competitor is consistent with the good things that happen. The intermediate case, which is always the hardest to regulate, are monopolies, either privately and so forth. They do have serious resource losses in some case, but the enforcement of these rules can often go off the edges in others. And so I think, in effect, what happens is you can get a strong consensus on that. And as you start to apply that with respect to the internet, what it means is if you say something that other people find offensive or find going to hurt their particular business prospects, that's all the more reason to allow and to protect this speech. It's only when they start to engage in defamation or in fraud or abuse or threats of a libertarian variety that you want to put them on the other side. The difficulties that come in all of these areas, however, do not relate to the question of what we think to be the good and the bad kinds of behaviors in this country. In China, it's obviously a very different proposition as to what is or is not virtuous. The question that you always have is the way in which you structure the remedy system to take care of cases where there is going to be some kind of violations with respect to the norms. And what you discover, whether you're talking about cyberspace, or you're talking about environmental protection, or you're talking about bankruptcy and corporate abuse of one kind or another, is there are always two problems. One is you can go too hard and shut down legitimate stuff in order to get rid of the illegitimate stuff, or you can go too soft, and what you should do therefore is to let too much illegitimate stuff go by and you don't get enough of the legitimate stuff. So take the question of monitoring. I often thought that, well, all these cases are going to be hard. Then I listened to your presentation and I say to myself, no, there's some cases in which I do not think any person in the United States who is imbued with a First Amendment tradition would find the Chinese system of oversight acceptable on constitutional terms. I don't think that this is a particularly bold problem. So where is it that you then want to move? Well, we do want to have security cameras, I think, on a whole variety of places. I'm not interested in jaywalking, but I am interested in stopping murders, riots, meddling, and so forth. The question is how you do it. And I do think it's a combination of legal and technical solutions that are involved. And so I am perfectly in favor of having continuous recordation of various kinds of activities. And in certain cases, what happens is you store it for an hour or so, and then as new stuff comes in, you drop the other stuff out. But in certain kinds of controversial or more difficult cases, like, for example, on entrance to airports or subways and so forth, you may store the information almost indefinitely, but the source of protection that you're going to build into the system is you're going to have restricted access of these situations dependent upon presentation to somebody, a judge, a magistrate, or so forth, of something, either probable cause or reasonable suspicion, before you can kind of access the stuff. And if you don't do that, you'll get things like the Boston Marathon killers, and the only way they managed to trap that guy is because the Macy's cameras were running when all the public cameras were shut down because of a overly great concern with respect to privacy. And so I think, in effect, that the fundamental challenge with respect to any and all legal situations that we have to face is figuring out how you design this optimal set of remedies to deal with these kinds of problems. I don't think it's the question of moral knowledge. I think it turns out to be very much the question of technical implication. And so what do we then start to do? Well, let me just give you sort of one of the hard cases, which I think shows you why it's difficult. You take a company like Facebook. I am not on Facebook. I have no desire to be on Facebook. I am on Twitter. I have no desire to be on Twitter, which shows you something about the way in which the psyche of the modern mind starts to work. And the question is, how do you think of it? If you recall, I mentioned earlier on that the difficult category that you have is neither coercion on the one hand nor pure competition on the other, but it's the question of monopoly control over a given resource, which creates some kind of a correlative duty of fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory service, and may give you, that's with respect to access, and give you some particular obligations to control who gets on, so that true statements are made and fake news, to use everybody's favorite term, is going to be kept off of these particular kinds of systems. Okay, we start to do this, and then the first question you have to ask is, how do you start to apply this in this world? So is Facebook a kind of a monopoly? And you start looking back at the traditional antitrust law on this, and basically what it is, it's the fiendish application of a final examination question on a very hard class, which there is no good answer. Because what we are told on the one hand is if you generate this particular monopoly by innovation, hard work, imagination, and so forth, God bless, because the whole point of a system is to create desirable forms of incentives in the ex-ante state of the world so as to produce a bunch of technologies which would not otherwise exist if you're going to constantly slap people down who start to innovate. But if, on the other hand, you engage in what somebody affectionately calls unfair practices, undefined term, in which you get this by an illicit method, now what happens is you do subject them to the antitrust law. And so the question that you would put on jeopardy is, what is Facebook? Which side of the line does it fall on? Do you like the traditional definition, Or do you start to say, I'm not so much worried about ex-ante effects on the creation of information and so forth. I'm worried about ex-post ways in which these things are used once the monopoly power is gone. So the major debate in antitrust circles today, and Gus and I are doing a conference on this, right, in about 2 months, a little bit less than that, is the question of to what extent do you follow that Grinnell formulation, or do you start to say we're less concerned on the front end, say Facebook is now big and so therefore it's a proper topic of regulation. Great. You've now decided it's a proper topic of regulation. What do you do then? Becomes a very serious question. And when you listen to the various conversations about China or everything else, you always come up with the following sense. It is very easy to imagine cases in which you desperately wish to see some form of regulation be imposed upon somebody because of a genuine, palpable, and legitimate harm for which ex post remedies by way of don't work. So you have something which is stated by way of defamation on a particular site like this. Somebody loses a job, loses a marriage, loses a friendship, and so forth. These are real harms. They've been cognizable in the law since Roman times, quite literally. And then it turns out the individual perpetrator is somebody whom you cannot get. And so it's the classic question of a legal system. First, legitimate remedy is unavailable for practical reasons. Is there a backstop remedy you could bring against somebody else, which will essentially give him the inducement to control? Do we ever believe in that? Of course we do. The whole doctrine of respondeat superior is essentially based on exactly that position, and nobody's in favor of removing it. But there are lots of cases in which you don't believe in that doctrine. Independent contractors give different issues from this, and platform economies are exactly the kind of things you're frightened about, because if you give them the power to remove stuff which is potentially defamatory, then they could use that power in a selective fashion. So you're then worried about discriminatory application. So I see this as all as damned if you do and damned if you don't in all of these particular contexts. I think the framework is strong enough to say that the totalitarian approach of the Chinese is not acceptable. And remember what the origin of the word totalitarian is. It comes from the word total, right? We get total control over everything. So you could reject that. And trying to dislodge it is very difficult. Trying to tell Google and Apple, we're not going to let you sell phones in China because you're aiding and abetting a tyrant, is a perfectly respectable position, which will cost you $200 billion in the American stock market on any kind of a short-term basis. I don't say this on abstract speculation. The stock in Apple is down already 30 or 40 points off, or 30% off its top, and it's mainly the China market which is driving that decline. I'd say about 70% of it is that. So this is where you're at. And so what do you really have to do? I think, in effect, I have 10 seconds to give a solution, which I cannot provide, but I will say what I think to be the key element. The only people who are going to have a shot at getting this thing right are people who build into their very bones a deep awareness of the trade-offs that have to be dealt with in terms of forward-looking regulation. And so that whenever somebody says, let's go in this direction, they're starting to say, are you going too far? And the same thing on the other side. If you really want to get a dystopian economy, what happens is if you see one kind of error and you ignore the other kind of error, you will either go very much too fast or very much too slow. And so what happens is these judgments that you needed in the old equity cases, when do you give an injunction? When do you start it? How broad does it go? How often do you review it? We used to say in private law, these were balancing of equities subject to the sound discretion of the trial judge. Well, in an ordinary nuisance case, you're kind of prepared to live with it. Unfortunately, the problems are now 1 billion times more important, but you don't have any better standard than the one that you had in that case, which is why this issue is so unsettling and why it was they chose to have me speak last, so that I would clear all illusions of a utopian solution. Thank you.
Okay, so since we've settled all of that, we can go home. No, we should have some discussion. So I certainly want to make sure we have time for questions and discussions from the audience. I will start first, however. Do any panelists have questions or responses to your co-panelists?
Yeah, I have a question if nobody else does. I'm not a blockchain guy, right? But look, the question about security, I think there are two problems about it that one has to confront. One is if good guys can use blockchains, bad guys can use blockchains. And so the data that you can basically preserve is information that allows you to figure out whom to bribe and whom to corrupt, whom to subvert, whom to kidnap and so forth, which you could then circulate a bunch of den of thieves. And I don't see how one stops it in one sense. And the second problem that I'm always worried about this is there is a way to stop a trademark. I know that you have a key, and I come up to you and I say, look, you know, in olden days I would have said your money or your life, but these are new times, so either give me your passcode, I'm going to blow your brains out. And once you do that, you can get into the system by those kinds of methods. So, I mean, so how does one deal with that? We had this problem 20 odd years ago when the question is whether or not the government had a backdoor getting its way into any of these encryption systems that were used to transfer confidential social information. I testified against them because I said the moment the government creates a backdoor, you can be sure everybody else in the world is going to use it. They will figure out the weakness and they'll go through in droves. And like all good computer guys, you learn how to enter a site and cover your tracks so it appears as though you've never been there. And once you do this thing, I'm just curious as to how you deal with those two very serious political risks of a blockchain technology.
Sure. Yeah. So on the private key management issue, that is a concern, right? The way that it's combated is not to eliminate it. I think there's no clear way to eliminate that, and there's lots of folks that are trying to do that. You try to limit the risk of that. And one way in which blockchains do that is actually through transparency. So you can begin to trace lots of the transactional information that happens on the network to see if there was some sort of breach of some sort. And that's what information security folks do today. They cannot eliminate break-ins, but they can at least track and understand and identify it. So that provides one of the solutions.
So I mean, criminal guys can use this technology.
So absolutely, it is neutral, right? You can store any information that you want in a blockchain, and that has some positive use cases. When you think of things like China, it has some disastrous use cases if it's used for things like state secrets or obscene or defamatory information, right? Things that most folks would say you should not disseminate or use this to disseminate that. But as a technology, it's neutral. In terms of other means of keeping it secure, the nice thing about a blockchain, at least up until this point, and there's been effectively a $60 billion bounty in figuring out if there's ways to kind of corrupt the system. Nobody has yet figured that out. That doesn't mean that it's not feasible, but some of the best information security folks, some of the best white and black hackers have been going at the system for now a decade, and they haven't been able to basically corrupt it yet. So is it perfect? Probably not, but it may be the best option to begin to solve some of these issues. And these are issues related to things like managing information, but extends beyond that. It's also moving around value and actually bringing back into the internet something that's soulfully or woefully missing, which is property rights. We don't have them online. Now you have the ability to actually mint and create and keep track of scarce resources. So lots of the commons problems that we've seen with the internet can begin to get narrowed by thinking about using this as kind of a new backstop.
I think the upside is enormous. I'm worried about the flip side.
Yeah.
And that's so
And there
often
is a
the
flip
case
side.
with technology.
Yeah, I mean, it can be, there's going to be ways in which blockchains can be abused, but I do think the upside and potential ways to preserve First Amendment rights, potential ways to begin to imbue into the internet property-based right systems will pay significant dividends. And I think the way that you can ensure that there aren't multiple blockchains, there's not a balkanization of blockchains, and I imagine that China will, at some point, probably create its own blockchain, is basically to win the network, right? This is what we did with the internet. We spread the US-based internet far and wide. We brought on people as stakeholders, not just in the US, but in Europe and in other parts of the globe, and they choose to use our internet as opposed to the Chinese internet, right? They could choose to use that, and I think here we are at a similar inflection point where we need sensible rules and regulations so people choose the US or US and EU, which is effectively who maintains these networks, these blockchains, as opposed to the new ones that are coming out of China.
Yeah, that's one of the most important points, I think, that we have to understand. From the U.S. perspective, we believe in First Amendment style freedom of speech. That is exceptionally idiosyncratic. We're basically the only country in the world who has as strong views about freedom of speech as we do. Most of the rest of the world is very different. We are not going to win freedom of speech battles globally by asserting our Constitution, our Bill of Rights says freedom of speech is sacrosanct. If we want to win against China, what we need to do is build the network and get there first and have the network effects have our preferred technological platform that embeds at least freedom of speech compatible rights in it, and have that become the global winner. And that's how we are going to affect change and preserve these rights on a global scale. All these platforms are global, and we need to remember that.
Can I ask just one point here? I mean, it's beyond just First Amendment rights. It is property rights. It's market-based capitalistic systems that are embedded into the technology. So software can scale in the ways that law and, frankly, sovereigns cannot.
That's great.
And this is a unique opportunity where we basically have a computing system that can embed, in a large part, U.S. and U.S. ideals and have it scale globally. And that is incredibly powerful and something that I think is incredibly important if we want to solve these issues so we don't have this dystopian world that I think is quickly coming into focus and which terrifies me and keeps me up at night as well.
Well, I want to say something, which is that this is happening in the U.S. too, and you are giving away your data all the time for convenience. So some of the things you can do just with your face right now that are already operational in China and that people are very happy about. If you have high social credit in China, life is very easy and very good for you. You can withdraw cash from ATMs just using your face. You can access office buildings just using your face. You can check in airports just using your face. You can pay for goods just using your face. In fact, KFC in Hangzhou has a smile to pay system where you just smile when they say the thing, and based on at KFC.
Why would you be smiling if you're at KFC?
You want the food, don't you? So and people, and by the way, the Chinese Airbnb, Zhaotu uses facial recognition to check in guests. So it's happening everywhere. And by the way, when you have an iPhone, the new iPhones use your facial recognition. It is based on the same software and the same system. And we are giving away our data all the time. And here in the US, this data is being used the same way by private companies. I don't want you to think this is just China doing this all the time. Uber famously collected information on customers' one-night stands and demonstrated the God view that could track anyone anywhere through their cell phone. Amazon is infamous for tracking workers' movements within warehouses and a patent for a new wristband that could track them within a few inches at all times, including, and gives haptic feedback, which is that vibration feedback to guide their hands to the right bin. NSO created the Pegasus software that went onto cell phones and was used to scan all texts, all emails, all instant messaging systems, activate your camera, your microphone, and be able to spy on anything that was happening anywhere. And by the way, this was used by private companies against journalists, against all kinds of people. It was happening in Mexico and in the Emirates, and it was happening in lots of places. This is now in general usage in the private sector all the time on all your devices and all your phones. So the issue is this is happening constantly, and you're being tracked constantly. You probably know that when you have a cell phone and you go into a store, when you get on the Wi-Fi or you pass certain sound frequency receptors, they're tracking your movement within the store, and you'll get the advertisements for the toothpaste because you're in the toothpaste aisle and staring at it, right? And then you go to the next aisle and you get advertisements there. This is happening in real time, and all that tracking is being consolidated and used to create profiles of who you are, including what your political affiliations are, what things you might be sympathetic to. This is the stuff that Cambridge Analytica was using in the last election, allegedly. And there's all this information that they can put together to create a profile of you that statistically is more accurate in your preferences and what you will respond to emotionally than what your spouse knows. So it's not just third world countries. This is what's happening in a digital world where you're living your life online. And the question is, it's not just the government doing this. This is available all the time for everyone. You can buy this information on people constantly, and we are giving it out all the time. And the question is, are we comfortable with all the applications there? Do we want to think about that? This should be something that people are aware of and discussing, at least.
Richard, I think you have a response.
Well, no, I have, again, it's the yin and the yang, to use an expression. So you're Amazon, and what you do is you manage to track movements within a factory, And what happens is you increase the productivity of workers by, let's say, 25%. And what you then do is you manage to increase their wages by 12.5%, and you keep the other half of the percent. And it sort of looks like a win-win transaction in that particular setting. But on the other hand, what they do is then they follow you when you're going somewhere else, and they now have a sense that you are or are not engaged in personal relationships, which you would like to keep private, medical records when you're going to a hospital and so forth. To me, it's the same problem that you have using this stuff where there's consent on the other side for purposes of mutual benefit. Strikes me as being a different problem from the situation where it's collected surreptitiously, used against people in various kinds of ways. And what I don't know is, given that the immense fluidity of the technology, is whether or not in practice you could figure out which particular uses of the stuff is legit and which of these things is not. And what I would like to see somebody do with respect to Amazon or any of these employers is actually force them to sit down under subpoena, give you the stuff that you have, and sort of watch the various kinds of uses that you start to do, and then try to figure out which set of laws you would want to put into place in order to regulate them. But I mean, from what you said, this cat has already left the bag. This horse has left the barn. You're never going to get run a world in which people do not have facial recognition stuff. And I think I'm right to say that from your view, the level of progress on this stuff on the technical side is actually getting more rather than less rapid in terms of the way in which we could do it. Because the Chinese are doing this with 1,400,000,000 people. I mean,
1.4 billion.
that's what I said, right? And I can't tell. I'm so bad on facial recognition, I can't tell my daughter from the neighbor sometime and so forth. I mean, it's just scary to see that. But and crowd recognition and so forth. On the other hand, if I'm trying to track down a killer, boy, oh boy, I want my police force to be able to get it. And so that technology that I mentioned to you is you collect the information and you have very rigorous rules on the way you get it out, which is used with respect to auditing phone calls through the various compromises that were done on NSA audits and so forth, citizens and non-citizens. I think that's where one really has to look to see if we could do it. And the issue is whether or not the technology is so fluid that every time we have a strategy, there's going to be a better counter strategy put together, because the government is slow, awkward, balky, and dissenters, and an entrepreneur is coherent, rapid, and responsive. So what you do is you have the bad guys, if they are bad guys, basically being able to move twice as fast or 10 times as fast as the good guy. And I don't know how you overcome that structural deficit.
If there are any questions from the audience, please start raising your hands. Lee, yes.
Yes. By the way, now in honor of this conversation, I want to show you something I'm going to do. Turn my phone off. And then my wife won't be able to reach me.
And the Chinese won't be able to hear your answers.
Well,
I guess we're being recorded.
I mean, the Chinese basically have done illegal translations of my takings book.
Oh.
Notice the strong property rights. He's got a following, but they translated in violation of copyright rules, right? And I say thank you.
Lee Otis with the Federalist Society. I guess I'm curious how the Chinese deal with the signal-to-noise problem, because, and it may be that I have a hypothesis that it may not matter that much to them. That is to say that it may be more that the way, they don't really care that their social credit system is that accurate. Maybe what they care about is the fact that they have it. But it does strike me that, to run this thing would require somebody assigning,
rankings.
Figuring out how to assign social credit for all this ludicrous activity that's totally uninteresting to a normal human being. It sort of sounds like a nightmare to me to, this is like all people's Facebook baby pictures and so on, so how do they deal with that?
So as a technical matter, the signal to noise ratio concern I don't think really applies quite in this context. So the signal to noise ratio idea that I introduced was with respect to the individual's ability to process information. And the technical response for the Chinese system is by adding more processing capability. So if when Twitter starts sending me more information, I could replace my one brain with 10 brains. I would have a greater processing capability, so I would be able to process more information. The signal-to-noise ratio concern would be diminished. That said, turning to the Chinese social credit system, the two responses I would offer are, first, it's still in beta, so they're still developing this. There was a high-profile problem with it a couple of weeks ago where the CEO of a company, for advertising reasons, her face was on a van that drove across the street. The cameras caught that, and they thought they saw her face. They saw it going across the street. The signal was red. They thought she was jaywalking. She got a ticket. So there are still glitches that they're trying to work out. Now, at some level, it doesn't matter. Both from the do they care perspective, I doubt that they care that much, but also it's not binary. So it's my understanding that the system, there are, to use the example, you pick up the bottle of Jack Daniels that has been, through machine learning, massive multiple regression, statistical methods, determined to be a signal that you're a lower credit individual, so you get the ding. You do something that's been associated with pro-social conduct through statistical methods, you get the plus. And of course, there will be monkeying around with the system for political purposes. But that's my understanding. It's not you do one bad thing, it's a problem, but you need to do a system of bad things.
Actually, we have the same systems here in the US, and it's a lot of startups that are working on this. So there was a huge technology fair in China where they were describing how they're working on some of the algorithms because they were trying to sell it to foreign markets. So these algorithms they're actually developed by private companies and they're available for sale. You can buy a lot of the stuff that powers the Chinese state system. And in the fintech industry, they actually, in the peer-to-peer lending space on some of the platforms, they use some similar algorithms by going through your social media and going through your Facebook accounts, going through who you're connected to, and by the same types of techniques that the Chinese state is using for its social credit scores. By determining who your friends are and your friends' behavior, they're assigning you a credit score. So that is actually already part of our consumer product lending system. And this tracking stuff is happening all the time. In this hotel, I was asked whether I was a Hilton Honors member and how high I was on the Hilton Honors system because I could get this, or I could get this, or I could get this. I mean, that follows you everywhere. And every major company is now developing this technology to know their customer and develop full profiles of your preferences, what you're likely to buy, when you're likely to buy it, what triggers you to buy things. So certain people are emotionally triggered by certain types of advertisements, and they'll note those and use those triggers on you repeatedly through different media sites. So these developmental, these descriptions of you are really readily available, and you can get most of this stuff. In fact, it is an interesting thing to, if you ever get a chance to, start buying some of this data on yourself. I mean, it's astonishing what they have.
But the interesting thing is, you said they know better than your spouse.
They do. Statistically,
but I think that's
they know better
not
than
only
spouses.
true, but I think from what you said, they know my preferences better than I know my preferences.
They know how to push your buttons. I mean,
Well,
that's what
I mean,
they're
and I don't know.
studying
I
at
mean,
every
look,
point.
every
To
one
get
of
you
us
to buy
has
something or get you to
personality
do
tricks,
something
bad
else.
habits, and so forth that are so ingrained in our DNA that we don't even aware that we're doing it. And it's only when the characteristic gets to us that you realize who or what you are. And that's what these guys are doing, exactly the same thing. Now, in terms of getting it rightly, I disagree with you or whatever. I think they have every incentive to get it right. It turns out they want to promote leaders and they want to put people in jail. They know that their success is going to be disastrously impacted if what they do is they promote the revolutionary and they put the loyalists behind the bars. And so just as Hilton doesn't want to give the rewards to the faithless customer, these guys don't want to make mistakes. It's the question of ends the means are neutral, technologically neutral. It's the ends of what matter, and they're doing it for insidious purposes. And as far as I can see, the Hilton is not doing it in any particular way. This is no different from loyalty discounts that you give to people who repeat purchases when you gave the S&H green stamps or the blue chip stamps back in the 1950s. I mean, similar kinds of devices. And so, again, I'm going to say it seems to me that you cannot be agnostic about ends when you worry that much about means.
I'll also add, for the social media and advertising networks in the United States, the quality of the data that they have is actually really bad. It's incrementally better than if they didn't know anything about us, which is why the advertisers think it's a value to them. Catherine Tucker at MIT has done a number of studies of this. But to give you a personal example, not the last time, but one of the last times I checked, most of the ad networks, you can actually log in and get the information that they have about you, the demographic information that they've tried to infer about you.
You can't get that in China.
Right, but in the United States. And in China, they'll
with an ID number.
Oh, but
you can buy from anyone who has a Chinese ID number, you can buy the information on them. Almost everyone.
But you can't just log in. And most of the ad networks in the United States, you can log in and see what preferences they have about you. And recently, when I did this on, I think it was the Twitter demographics they had about me, they estimated simultaneously that my income was between $25,000 and $50,000 and between $250,000 and $500,000, that I was both male and female, that I enjoyed boating, golf, and sports cars. Now, only one of all those attributes is true about me.
You're male.
Yes, that's the one that is correct about me. But this is the information that they were using to target ads at me. And why do they do this? Well, it's incrementally better than if they knew absolutely nothing about me. So it is valuable, at least for advertising purposes in the United States. Now, there are data brokers in the United States that have much more accurate information about me, but there's value even though it's such a noisy piece of information. And there's so
R
much.
squared 0.1 is greater than R squared 0.
Exactly. Other questions? Jeremy.
So this kind of goes to, I was thinking about this with Gus's, Jeremy Kidd, Mercer University Law School. When Gus, you were talking about, slowing it down. I know you're slowing down the information because it's too rapid and we don't have the third-party filters that we used to. And that got me thinking about, there are two problems with any solution that we create. One you've already hinted at, which is any solution to slow down the information will, of course, be hijacked by rent seekers for political or economic gains. But the second is that, if we slow the information down, let me take a step back. It may be that we don't have good third-party filters yet, and that the technology for filtering hasn't caught up to the technology for dissemination of information. And yet, if we slow the information down in the wrong way, we've actually limited the rationale and the incentives for creating the new types of filters, right? Because we'd like all of the information if we could process it. If we can filter it correctly, we'd love to. That information is a positive. The problem is the lack of filtering, but we may stymie innovation in filtering if we limit the flow now, and that's in addition to potential rent seeking. So.
I'm not sure that I saw the question mark there, so I'll just say yes. I agree with you that there are myriad concerns. Echoing something that Richard has said several times, the problem with all of these technologies and all these concerns is that there are good and bad uses for them. And just thinking in terms of the velocity of information, it's really good to get accurate information into the marketplace of ideas as quickly as possible. That's something that high velocity, great. We love that. In fact, Laidlaw v. Oregon, one of my favorite cases to teach.
Yes.
Caveat emptor. The fact that I have better information than you and I trade on it and am able to exploit you and make gains from trade because you had bad information, that's good. We want to reward that because it creates an incentive to bring valuable information to the market.
But the case was a remand because the question was whether or not the direct question had been asked.
Mm-hmm. Regardless, the economic principle.
Well, the
is
principle
sound.
is, yes, if you
Yes.
have the information, but it's interesting in face-to-face conduct, when the guy knows he has an information deficit and says, cure it before I trade, at that point, the principles then change from market information to fraud
Right.
or non-disclosure.
Yeah, absolutely. But turning to a different sort of case, ordinary news media, what incentives do they have? Well, to get the best information out as quickly as they can. That's kind of a neutral, yeah, there are going to be mistakes, but their incentives are kind of, they want to get good information out. Then we have misinformation. I want to get fraudulent information. This is the fraud case out, which imposes a burden on the receiver of the information to verify it. That's a negative externality if we think about it at scale. Then we have disinformation, where the goal is to corrupt the information source, to make it so that you can't trust anything coming to you over Twitter, or to create mass confusion. And if you can manipulate the signal to noise ratio by intentionally putting bad information out there, you can cause extreme harm. The problem is ex ante, it's hard to know. Filters have limited capability to determine which information is which. And in fact, if we're in a disinformation context, we're in an adversarial context, where the filters, even if they work perfectly today, we develop perfect filters to filter out the disinformation sources. Well, I'm going to figure out, if I'm the bad actor, how those filters work, and I'm going to turn that methodology against them in order to find a way to repollute the information stream. So the adversarial nature turns this into a strategic game. And strategic rules are much more complicated than static rules.
Yeah. I'll give one illustration. When you sell medicines, you have to sell them under codes to ensure authenticity, which means that there are other people who are trying to break it. So one of my friends was president of Abbott Laboratories, and I asked him, how often do you have to change the codes in order to keep those things safe? And the answer was several times a month.
On the timepiece and velocity of information, I always struggle here with the fact that it's probably pragmatically impossible to implement, except in the context of systems like blockchains. Why slow down? If you're going to slow down the information, somebody else will just make something that's faster. Yep. And particularly when it comes to news, which I think is one of the core topics that we're discussing, people will choose faster news. So, I mean, the idea that you're going to somehow slow down and make a more deliberative news cycle, I think that time has passed. Yep. It's a lot like the data collection pieces that we were talking about before. The notion that we're not going to collect data, it's not to be a technological fatalist, it's past. We're going to be collecting data. Now it's the rules related to that. So I don't know if the timing piece is as useful here. I think even these timing questions have been addressed in financial markets, right? We've had financial markets and high frequency trading. People have tried to slow it down. And nobody wanted to use it. They just chose the one where it was faster because that was a much more efficient system. So I think you're just fighting against efficiency, and that's unlikely ever to be the long-term solution.
And you should also note that the better information changes the gap between ask and bid, right? These spreads used to be in 1987 when they had the crash, they were over 1%. And now they're probably 0.01% of 4 or 5 orders of magnitude. So the only way you can make money is through speed on the one hand and through volume of transactions on the other. And in fact, there have been some cases on this stuff where was shut down, unfortunately, where selling people information that you have gathered from public sources on, say, essentially what happens is a second is an eternity in that market for people who can get this information under pre-planned programs and put it into execution. Gives them a material advantage, and before the system was shut down by the Second Circuit in a very bad set of opinions, that information got out to the market very quickly for prepared players, but you had much more accurate pricing for everybody else. But that gives you the sort of the sense of the orders of magnitude that you're working.
I see 2 questions here. I think we have time for one left. If there were a way I could auction it all. Oh, wow. I was going to try and extract some rents, but it doesn't work. Yes.
I was going to say, let us both ask, and you decide which to answer. My question is, to what extent American companies have been involved in developing the Chinese technology To what extent are American police departments, for example, able to purchase that technology? And what do you think about the use of the law to prevent either of those?
We already have live examples of both. So, for example, in 2014, so the US already has, the FBI has a facial recognition database that is based a lot on this technology. And there was a revolt at Amazon because Amazon was actually selling the US military, but also law enforcement agencies. They bought this crowd technology that I showed you. That's in use in law enforcement agencies all across the US. In 2014, which is quite a few years ago now, in technological development terms, the Chicago Police Department used the facial recognition technology to catch and convict a thief. We know that in Britain, they used the Japanese neo-face technology to find a wanted man in a crowd in May 2017. So it's actively used. By the way, in the US, I just want to point this out, there are at least 62 million surveillance cameras that are actively hooked to FBI networks and other things. That is actually, that's as of 2016, so that's like old data now. That's actually per capita a greater penetration than in China. Than in China, per capita. So this technology is actually far more advanced and being used constantly in the US. And we do know that the facial recognition technology is being used by police departments. And for crowd, definitely the crowd technology that I showed you is in use in police departments all the time. And we know that the reading of the facial recognition technology, and especially the emotion reading technology, is in use in airports and in other places. That's been publicly disclosed. And there's been, just so you know, there have been revolts at Amazon, there have been revolts at Microsoft over the military applications of their work. There have been really public revolts at Google. There were 14,000 Google employees who signed a letter of protest against Project Dragonfly, which is the search engine for China that would block certain searches and also link all searches to users' phone numbers so you could immediately identify who was doing what. And then there was a big protest with 4,000 signatures at Google over the DeepMind learning projects, which were going to be used for a lot of this facial recognition security work, actually in direct contradiction with the contracts that Google had signed. It's now Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google. Yeah. So DeepMind is actually a part of Alphabet, but they had signed contracts with London-based DeepMind, which is a deep machine learning system, saying that when they bought DeepMind, it was not going to be used for either surveillance or military application. And now they had over several dozen employees quit, finding out that that's exactly how it's being used.
Or should we not try? I mean, as opposed to employee
Don't
boycott.
use pronouns.
Constitutional scholars, you want to take this on?
Well, there have been cases about the U.S. versions of all these programs, PRISM and NSA, FISA, all this, and some of them have been dismissed because of lack of standing. They couldn't prove they were actually subject to the program and had suffered an adverse consequence. Some of them are being dismissed or about to be dismissed because of state secrets privilege. And then others could be dismissed upon, executive power, separation of powers, reasoning, or gaps in statutes where they had a intelligence exception or a law enforcement exception to a privacy right. The one that sort of most advances in the Third Circuit, where the plaintiff was able to cite NSA documents from Snowden, basically saying that the strategy was to collect it all and exploit it all, meaning Google, Facebook, YouTube, Yahoo, everything. So that case is proceeding, but it's on the brink of being dismissed for state secrets privilege. So if you can get past standing and then state secrets privilege and then the statutory defenses, maybe there could be some kind of a trial for a U.S. application, not necessarily as to facial recognition, but as to interception and exploitation of person-to-person emails or private messages that have a reasonable expectation of privacy in them.
Another aspect of this, the recent Carpenter opinion suggests that there could be Fourth Amendment restrictions on government collection or government access to collected data for government purposes. the full contours of Carpenter are really unclear. That case involved historic cell site location information. So your cell carrier has historic records of every tower that your phone has spoken to. And under the Stored Communications Act, the government could get access to that with less than a Fourth Amendment warrant. And the Supreme Court said, no, that amounts to something required that has Fourth Amendment protections. The full contours are unlikely. It doesn't touch private actors making use of this information. Perhaps to suggest a pro-social aspect, not to end on a glib note, I have heard some suggestion that universities are thinking about using technologies like this for class attendance purposes. So
It's already active in Britain. Britain actually uses facial recognition technology.
Well, you see
in
whether you
some
come
of
to
its
class?
schools. Yeah, for attendance purposes and also to monitor teachers who are taking breaks for too long.
Oh.
Remember that in the
One other
bathroom.
thing I would say about Carpenter, I think it's a wrong decision, but I think the problem that you have is the claim in Carpenter wasn't that we can do it at any old time we ask. Their claim was we need reasonable suspicion before we could get the location data, and then we could use that to get the probable cause data. That argument was not put forward, but I think that's actually a stronger view than the one that the Chief Justice took.
Yep. Yeah, and who knows how Carpenter is going to
Well, yeah, and we
play
don't
out.
know because this is basically Terry versus Ohio is a third standard, which has to be part of the reasonableness test under the Fourth Amendment, which tends to get suppressed.
Okay, well, I see that we are 2 minutes over, so I expect I should shut things down before Lee gives me the hook. So thank you all. Thanks to the panelists.